There was a time, not so long ago, when the Roman world felt unshakable. A time when marble cities bathed in Mediterranean light echoed with laughter and Latin, when merchants crossed provinces without fear, and when legions stood watch not as desperate defenders, but as quiet guardians of peace. That world, frozen in golden stillness under the long shadow of Augustus, seemed eternal, and many believed it would never end. For nearly 2 centuries, Rome had known something rare in ancient history: stability. Its emperors, some wise, others cruel, had ruled an empire that stretched from the misty shores of Britannia to the sun-scorched deserts of Arabia, from the forests of Germania to the bustling ports of Alexandria. Roads stitched it together like veins. Law and coin and culture pulsed through every corner. And above it all stood the legions, professional, disciplined, and feared. But nothing lasts forever. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, the tide began to shift. His son Commodus took the throne, and while Rome had seen worse rulers before, his reign marked something deeper, a rot beneath the marble. Corruption crept back into the Senate. Discipline frayed. And though the legions remained strong on paper, the system that held them together began to weaken in silence. Still, most Romans carried on as if the old world would endure. The frontiers were watched. The grain still flowed. But the air had changed. A sense of fragility, once unthinkable, had begun to settle over the empire like a whisper before the storm. Then came 192, the year Commodus died, and with him, the illusion of permanence. Civil war erupted like a crack in glass, sudden, violent, spreading fast. Generals turned on each other. Provinces broke loyalty. And across the empire, the men who had once sworn oaths to emperors now swore only to whoever paid them next. In the chaos that followed, Rome would burn, not all at once, not in a single battle, but slowly, relentlessly, from within. Yet amid the chaos, something extraordinary began to happen. The Roman army, long a symbol of order, found itself tested like never before. And instead of collapsing, it began to change. Out of the ruins of bureaucracy and shattered command chains, a new kind of military thinking began to emerge, one shaped not by tradition, but by necessity. Commanders could no longer rely on systems designed for a peaceful empire. They had to improvise, adapt, and lead men who had no illusions about glory, only survival. These were not the days of Augustus, where victory came with marble arches and golden laurel wreaths. These were the days of ambushes in rain-soaked forests, of border towns overrun by strangers, of soldiers holding lines that no longer felt safe. And it's here, in the dark heart of the 3rd century, that the story of Rome's military rebirth truly begins, not with triumph, but with fear, and not with conquest, but with endurance. Because as the empire cracked and split and bled, its armies were forced to decide whether they would fade with it, or rise and fight for something that still held meaning. What followed would not just change the Roman military, it would change what it meant to be Roman at all. When the empire began to fracture and the marble pillars of Rome started to tremble, the first to feel the shockwaves weren't the senators or the wealthy, but the young men standing in line under the open sky, waiting to be measured, inspected, and chosen. Recruitment in the 3rd century wasn't a grand ceremony or a matter of civic pride, it was survival, both for the empire and for the boy who stepped forward with calloused hands and tired eyes, hoping that the army might offer something more than the dirt and dust of his father's field. Rome didn't want city boys. It wanted farmers, herders, men with backs already bent by labor and hands familiar with pain. The legions were no longer filled with sons of patricians or noble heirs from polished villas, they were shaped by the rough edges of the provinces, drawn from the hard lands where life had never been easy and death was never far. These weren't just soldiers, they were tools of necessity, raised not for glory but for grit. And the army that once marched in shining rows beneath eagles and banners was becoming something more rugged, more provincial, more real. Sometimes it was voluntary, sometimes it was conscription, and sometimes it was desperation that brought them in. A whisper of steady pay. A rumor of land after service. A promise that, maybe, the sword could lift them higher than the plow ever could. But what they found was no path to comfort. It was mud, endless drills, brutal discipline, and the looming shadow of campaigns that might never end. They trained on empty stomachs, marched through snow and sand, and learned to fight not just for Rome, but for the man beside them who had grown up just as poor, just as forgotten. It was in those muddy camps, on windswept frontiers, that the Roman army began to shed its old skin. These weren't the legions of Augustus or Trajan, they were becoming something grittier, forged not in marble forums but in the smoke of burning outposts and the howls of border raids. Their commanders were changing too. No longer men of polished words and senatorial birth, but career soldiers who had bled their way up through the ranks, men who didn't need to impress with speeches because their scars did the talking. They saw the empire not as an idea, but as a map of fire lines, always shifting, always under threat. And as the old aristocratic legates faded, a new class of officers rose, chosen for their loyalty and experience, not for their lineage. These new leaders looked at their men and didn't see rabble, they saw steel under pressure, a force that could bend but not break. But even with tough men and tougher commanders, morale wasn't built on courage alone. Pay mattered. Recognition mattered. And when emperors realized that their power now rested on the loyalty of the army, they reached for the only currency that still held value, coin. Septimius Severus doubled the soldiers' pay and told his sons, with chilling clarity, to enrich the troops and ignore the rest. Later emperors followed suit, throwing denarii at problems they couldn't solve with politics, hoping gold could buy stability. But as the coins flowed faster, their value drained, and inflation turned once generous salaries into empty promises. And still, the legions marched. They didn't have the luxury of debating economic collapse. They had barbarians at the border, civil wars behind them, and orders that never stopped coming. A boy who joined at 17 might find himself serving not for 16 years, as the law once promised, but for 20, 30, even longer, his youth traded for scars and his reward delayed with every emperor who fell to a sword before paying what was owed. These were not soldiers of myth, they were men of mud and metal, holding the empire together one outpost, one road, one bloody skirmish at a time. And though Rome itself was splintering, though emperors rose and fell like dice in a game no one controlled anymore, these men remained. Not because they believed in Rome's perfection, but because the habit of standing the line was too deeply carved into them to do anything else. They weren't heroes. They weren't machines. They were men of iron, walking fields of mud, carrying a dying empire on their backs, and somehow, refusing to let it fall. In the 3rd century, emperors no longer rose from marble palaces or senatorial speeches, they rose from camps, from barracks, from the grit of the battlefield. Their armor still dusty from the last campaign as they were hoisted on shields and declared ruler by men with mud on their boots and swords in their hands. Rome was no longer ruled by politics, but by proximity to power, and power now lived in the army. These were the days of the soldier emperors, a time when the purple robe was not inherited but seized, and often at the point of a spear. For the legionary, this shift was both blessing and curse. On one hand, their loyalty had never been more valuable. They weren't just tools of the state anymore, they were the kingmakers. A cohort could make a commander emperor. A legion could unmake him just as fast. Their loyalty was the coin of survival, and every man on the throne knew it. That's why the pay kept rising. Septimius Severus had started the trend, rewarding his men richly and advising his sons, with brutal clarity, to enrich the soldiers and ignore everyone else. His son Caracalla took it further, doubling military pay again in a gesture that earned cheers from the ranks and groans from the treasuries. It was a short-term solution to a long-term collapse. Inflation spiraled. Coinage was debased. And still, the emperors kept promising more, because promises were easier than stability, and coins were cheaper than loyalty broken. But money alone wasn't enough. The emperors of this age knew they needed soldiers who could do more than fight, they needed men who would bleed for them, march endlessly, kill for a name they barely knew, and hold the crumbling edges of the empire against every storm. These emperors, most of them former generals, understood their armies because they had once marched among them. They spoke the same rough dialects, drank from the same cups, shared the same dirt. That made them relatable, but also dangerous. Because they didn't rule with philosophy, they ruled with force. And when their time was up, when another ambitious officer whispered in the right ears and the legions shifted their gaze, the fall was often as swift as the rise. One day you were imperator. The next, you were a headless body in a ditch. For the soldier, this chaos created a new rhythm of life. Allegiances shifted with geography. Loyalty wasn't about ideology, it was about leadership, charisma, protection. You followed the man who paid you, fed you, and didn't lead you into death for vanity's sake. The men knew the difference between a commander who would die with them and one who would sell their lives for a marble statue. And in this brutal clarity, a strange kind of democracy formed, one without votes, without debate, where the only ballot was blood, and the result was often written on the edge of a blade. It was during this time that the Senate's influence faded almost entirely from military affairs. Gallienus, one of the more stable emperors of the age, finally stripped the senatorial class of military command altogether. No more aristocrats leading legions they barely understood. From now on, command would go to professionals, tough, experienced men from the ranks, men who had earned their place through scars, not speeches. It was a radical shift, and for all the chaos of the era, it made sense. You couldn't afford the old ways anymore. The empire needed fighters, not philosophers. So the legions became a mirror of the empire itself, less elegant, more raw, more fractured, but still standing. And through it all, the soldiers remained at the center of everything. Not just as instruments of war, but as the thread holding the unraveling fabric of Rome together. Their hands crowned emperors. Their feet stomped across provinces. Their shields bore the weight of a world no longer stable. And as the borders were breached, as plagues swept through cities, as civil wars bled the empire from within, the soldiers kept marching. Not because they believed in the greatness of Rome, but because it was what they knew. They were soldiers of the barracks emperors, born from fire, loyal to strength, and forged in an empire that no longer ruled by law, but by the will of whoever the legions followed next. For centuries, the Roman legion had been the unshakable backbone of the empire, a symbol of unity and power, a machine made of men moving as one, fighting in precise formations with shared identity and purpose. To be part of a legion was to be part of something larger than yourself, a name, a history, a brotherhood. But in the 3rd century, even this symbol began to fracture. The legions weren't broken by a single defeat or destroyed by some foreign army, they were slowly, systematically pulled apart by the sheer weight of Rome's collapsing world. As the empire faced threats from every direction, from Germanic tribes crossing the Rhine to Persian armies pressing hard in the east, Rome discovered it no longer had the luxury of moving full legions across the map. The old model, thousands of men marching under a single eagle, had become too slow, too costly, too rigid for a world that now demanded speed, flexibility, and presence everywhere at once. And so a new solution emerged, born not from strategy but from desperation. They called them vexillations, detachments, splinters of the larger legions sent out under separate banners to plug holes in the frontier, to respond to sudden invasions, to fight wars that weren't waiting for Rome to catch up. These units weren't uniform in size or structure. Sometimes a few hundred men, sometimes over 1,000, they were cobbled together from different cohorts, stitched from whatever parts of the legion could be spared. And they moved fast, because they had to. There was no time for ceremony. No time to wait for orders from Rome. The frontier was bleeding, and these were the stitches holding it together. At first, this system was supposed to be temporary. The idea was that detachments would return to their parent legions after each campaign. But in practice, many never did. Some were stationed so far from their original base that the legion they came from stopped existing as a cohesive unit. Over time, Some vexallations became legions in all but name, drifting long enough to lose their tether to the past and forge a new identity in the field. And for the men serving in them, this shift wasn't just logistical, it was personal. The old pride of belonging to a specific legion, with its battle honors and traditions, began to fade. Now, identity was forged in the moment, in the mud of distant provinces, in the loyalty to a local commander, in the memory of a fight that no one in Rome even knew had happened. And yet, for all its chaos, this new system worked. Rome, fragmented and under siege, had found a way to keep fighting. Vexallations were nimble. They could be deployed faster, fed easier, and redirected in real time to where they were needed most. A city under siege in Gaul. A border raid in Dacia. A rebellion in Egypt. Instead of waiting for a full legion to arrive, Rome sent what it could, sharp, mobile units that could react without dragging half an empire with them. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't glorious. But it was effective. And for the empire in crisis, effectiveness was survival. This decentralization changed everything. Command structures had to adapt. Supplies had to be more flexible. Communication became urgent, less about ceremony and more about clarity. In many ways, the Roman army became less of a monolith and more of a web, a living network of fighting nodes spread across the empire, each acting independently but still tied, however loosely, to the same center. And while this made the army faster and more responsive, it also made it harder to control. The bonds that once held the legions together, the shared oaths, the rituals, the rhythm of marching and resting as one, were fraying. Loyalty became more personal, tied to immediate leadership rather than distant emperors. Discipline became localized. Reputation traveled not through official records, but through rumor and memory. But perhaps the most lasting change was psychological. The soldiers of this new era no longer saw themselves as part of an eternal machine. They saw themselves as survivors, problem solvers, professionals sent into the worst situations with little support and less recognition. And despite everything, the crumbling roads, the delayed pay, the constant danger, they fought. Because the idea of Rome, fractured though it was, still had weight. Not the grand ideal of senators in togas, but the simpler belief that the empire, for all its decay, was still worth holding on to. Not for the glory of conquest, but to keep the fires burning just a little longer. In the silence after battle, in the lonely outposts far from home, in the moments between orders and exhaustion, these men stood not as pieces of a perfect system, but as fragments of a broken one that still refused to die. The legions were no longer whole, but they were still alive. And in the cracks of an empire, that was enough. When people think of a Roman soldier, they often picture the clean lines of the Larica segmentata, the iconic iron bands gleaming under a Mediterranean sun, the square shield held firm, the short sword ready to thrust. But that vision belonged to an older age, a time of order, of empire and control. By the middle of the 3rd century, that armor was fading, just like the world that created it. Rome was no longer an empire of polished perfection, it was an empire under siege, and its soldiers no longer looked like statues come to life. They looked like survivors. The changes weren't just aesthetic. They were practical, urgent, and born from necessity. The gladius, once the hallmark of Roman infantry, short and perfect for tight, disciplined formations, began to vanish. In its place came longer blades, some so long they blurred the line between sword and spear, not because Rome had changed its doctrine, but because the battlefield had changed beneath its feet. The close-quarter fights in tight formations were being replaced by more fluid, less structured engagements, where reach could mean the difference between life and death. The new blades weren't elegant, they were functional, brutal, and forged for a soldier who might be fighting in a skirmish today and a siege tomorrow. But even as the weapons changed, the fundamentals didn't. The doctrine still emphasized the thrust, not the slash, because even as the army evolved, it clung to the logic of efficiency. One clean thrust was faster and deadlier than a wild swing. The soldier's body had to adapt too. Armor grew heavier, more enveloping, because the threats were no longer just from other disciplined formations, they were from ambushes, arrows, chaos. Chainmail, once reserved for officers or elites, became more common, stretching down arms and thighs, reinforced by plates, padding, and whatever could be found or improvised. Soldiers began to look less like uniform units and more like individuals pieced together from dozens of battles, each man wearing a different combination of scavenged or state-issued gear. Helmets followed suit, evolving from the finely crafted italic models with their clean lines and open faces to something more protective and far less refined. New designs covered the head more fully, adding crossbars and deep napes, shielding the neck and skull at the expense of hearing and peripheral vision. These weren't parade pieces. These were helmets meant to stop an axe to the face. In time, even these would give way to rougher, cheaper models inspired by Eastern designs, ridge helmets, segmented bowls, assembled fast, worn hard, replaced often. They weren't beautiful. But they worked. And in the 3rd century, that was all that mattered. The truth was, Rome could no longer afford beauty. The old standardized production lines that had once churned out identical sets of kit for every legionary were crumbling under economic pressure, inflation, and constant conflict. The state did what it could, but often it was up to the soldier himself to fill the gaps, to patch his mail, to trade for a better sword, to strap extra leather to his arms for protection. The army that had once been a symbol of Rome's order had become a mirror of its disarray. And yet, in that chaos, there was strength. Because every scratch on that armor, every dent in that helmet, every mismatched greave told a story, not of failure, but of endurance. These weren't museum pieces. They were battle-worn, weather-stained, shaped by fire and survival. And so were the men inside them. They weren't marching to show off imperial might. They were fighting to keep something alive. Not an ideal, not a perfect Rome carved in stone, but a living Rome, a breathing one, flawed, cracked, bleeding, but still breathing. In the end, it didn't matter what sword they carried or what helmet they wore. What mattered was that when the time came, they stood their ground. In rain, in snow, in sand. On walls, in forests, across rivers. They stood. And they fought. And somehow, in the darkness of a collapsing century, they kept the fire alive. Not because they were the best equipped, not because they were the most unified, but because they had no choice. Because someone had to carry the burden. And for that moment, it fell to them. The armor may have changed. The weapons may have changed. Even the meaning of the word legion had changed. But the heart of the soldier, the will to hold the line, to defend something bigger than himself, that stayed. And that was enough. By the end of the 3rd century, Rome was still standing, but it was not the Rome it had once been. The marble had cracked, the borders had shifted, the old rules no longer applied, and the men who now wore the eagle on their armor bore little resemblance to the tidy legions that had once marched beneath the arches of Augustus. What survived was not the illusion of imperial perfection, but something far more real, something forged in the fire of 100 forgotten battles, something that had learned to bend without breaking. The army that came out of the crisis of the 3rd century wasn't polished, it was patched. It wasn't uniform, it was improvised. But it worked. Somehow, against all odds, it worked. And that is what made it extraordinary. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Rome no longer believed in eternal peace. It no longer believed in inevitable dominance. What it believed in now was endurance. A cold, hard understanding that if the world was going to keep spinning, someone had to hold the line, someone had to ride out to the edge of empire and stare down the storm. And that someone was the soldier. Not the myth, not the marble hero, but the man in rusted mail with dirt on his face and scars he didn't bother hiding. He wasn't fighting for glory anymore. He was fighting for the simple idea that the empire might see another day. This shift in attitude reshaped everything. The legions became more than just tools of conquest, they became Rome's immune system, constantly on alert, constantly adapting, constantly absorbing the shock of a world that refused to stay still. Mobility became doctrine. Decentralization became strategy. Local garrisons, flexible detachments, semi-permanent field armies, it was messy, but it worked. The empire had accepted that there were no more clean victories, no more easy frontiers. Defense was no longer a wall, it was a dance. A constant adjustment, a readiness to strike, retreat, regroup, and strike again. And from that chaos, Rome learned something every civilization eventually must: how to survive not because of perfection, but because of resilience. The reforms of Gallienus and later Diocletian would cement this new mindset. Professionalism replaced prestige. Career soldiers replaced consular aristocrats. Merit was no longer an exception, it was the only path to command. The empire's military identity shifted from being the proud sword of Rome to the beating heart that kept its blood moving, slow and battered but still pulsing. These changes laid the groundwork for what would become the late Roman army, the force that would hold the frontiers for another century, that would fight off waves of invasions, and that would, in the east, evolve into the Byzantine military machine that would carry Rome's legacy for 1,000 years more. But it all began here, in the dirt and the doubt of the 3rd century, when nothing was certain and everything was at stake. This wasn't just a military transformation, it was a cultural reckoning. Rome had stared into the abyss of its own collapse and, instead of falling, it staggered back, bloodied and altered but still breathing. And it was the army, the broken, scattered, reformed, and reimagined army, that gave it that breath. In a way, these soldiers saved Rome not by winning every battle, but by refusing to stop fighting. They didn't preserve the empire as it was, they carried it into what it needed to become. They adapted. They endured. And because they endured, so did Rome. Not the Rome of marble temples and triumphal parades, but the Rome of dusty outposts, iron discipline, and silent loyalty. A Rome you don't read about in poems, but one that left its footprints in every province and its spirit in every soldier who picked up a blade and whispered the oath, even when the lights of the world seemed ready to go out.